I thought as you're feeling a little unwell, I would read you a story. This is a little book called The Happiness Box, and it's by a chap called David Griffin. And David Griffin was a Japanese prisoner of war, a British Japanese prisoner of war, between 1942 and 1945, and he was imprisoned in a place called Changi, which is in Singapore. And whilst he was there, he wrote this little story for the children who lived in the camp. Once upon a time, there was a chick-chack, and a chick-chack is like a little lizard, a monkey and a frog, who all lived together in a little house deep in the middle of the jungle. The chick-chack's name was Winston, and he was very clever. The monkey's name was Martin, and he looked after the house and did the cooking. The frog's name was Wobbly, and he worked in the garden. Every morning after breakfast, Winston used to climb the very highest tree in the jungle to set his wind trap. He was so clever that he had been able to think of the wind trap out of his own head. He set it at the top of the very highest tree, and he was able to catch wind in it. If a north wind was blowing, Winston would first of all catch it in his trap, then he would tie the wind up in a banana leaf and carry it home for lunch. But if a south wind was blowing, they would eat it for dinner, because the south wind tasted better. Old Wobbly worked all day in his garden, growing rice and vegetables, which he carried back to the little house in a small black bag with a silver lock on it. After Winston and Wobbly had set out each morning, Martin would make the beds and sweep out the house, and then he would go to the larder to see what they could eat for lunch. In the larder there was a big bin that Wobbly always kept full of rice, and there was a small bin with fruit and vegetables in it. Also, there were 4 bags into which Winston put the winds he had caught in his wind trap. Now, if the bag for the north wind was all blown out like a baby's cheeks, Martin knew that they could have boiled north wind for lunch, and he would decide to cook it very nicely for Winston and Wobbly. But this clever wind trap of Winston's was the only one in all the jungle, and every morning hundreds of creatures came to the back door and asked Martin for a few puffs of wind for their lunch too. Martin was such a dear old monkey that he never said no to anything, and so by the time that every jungle creature had been given a puff of wind, there was never any left to cook for Winston and Wobbly. Then Martin would give a sigh, because he too was very fond of boiled north wind, and he was not very fond of rice and vegetables. One day Winston and old Wobbly came back to the little house deep in the middle of the jungle. Winston gave his banana leaf full of wind to Martin, and old Wobbly went to the larder and emptied his rice and vegetables into the bins. When they sat down to lunch, Martin gave them each a plate of plain rice and vegetables without any wind at all. Winston said, "Where is the boiled north wind I trapped yesterday?" And Martin hung his head and answered in a sad voice, "The jungle people came to the back door and asked for some wind, and I gave it all away." Then old Wobbly, who had a very funny deep voice, said, "Never mind, Martin, I will grow plenty of rice and vegetables." And Winston says, "It doesn't matter, Martin, I'll trap more wind," and they all laughed and were very happy. Now, next day old Wobbly was digging in his rice field, and suddenly his spade uncovered a strange wooden box. He scraped away the mud and saw that the box was fastened with 3 big brass pins. The box was very heavy and old, and Wobbly could only just lift it, but he would not open it without his friends. At midday, when his work was done, old Wobbly hopped away to the little house. The big box was on his back, and the small black bag with the vegetables in it was on the top of the box, and he looked like a van piled with furniture. As soon as he reached home, old Wobbly put the wooden box on the lunch table, and when the others saw it, they became very excited. Martin cried out, "Quick, let's open it and see what's inside." But Winston, who was very clever, said, "No, don't touch it. It may be bewitched. We are very happy in our little house, and we have everything we want. We do not need the thing that is in that box." Then Martin looked sad and said, "Oh, Winston, couldn't we just have one look? We have everything in the world, but there are many creatures who have not. The box may be full of treasures which we could give to our neighbours." Winston nodded his head thoughtfully, but did not say anything. Then suddenly old Wobbly said in his funny deep voice, "Let's go in and ask the 3 wisest creatures in the jungle." "That's a good idea, Wobbly," said Winston. "Lock up the house, Martin, and we'll be off." So the 3 happy friends set off through the jungle. Martin swung himself along the branches of the tall trees, and old Wobbly hopped over the ground with Winston clinging on his back. The first place they came to was a great black swamp, guarded by glowworms who whizzed about in chariots drawn by giant mosquitoes. The swamp was the home of Dreamy Bill, the oldest and wisest tortoise in the world. He was fast asleep when they arrived at his house, but Martin woke him up by tapping on his shell with a pick handle which was put there on purpose. When at last Dreamy Bill poked out his head, Winston told him about the wooden box that old Wobbly had found and asked him if they should open it. "It's no good asking me questions," said Dreamy Bill, shutting one eye. "I gave up thinking over 100 years ago. You'd better ask Flappy. He knows most things." Having said this, he quickly drew his head back under his shell, and they heard his muffled voice saying, "Please go away and don't move the pick handle." So Winston, Martin and Wobbly continued their journey in search of Flappy, the wise king of the birds. Flappy lived at the north of the mouth of a huge dark cave in the heart of the jungle mountains. As they drew near the cave, they saw thousands of fierce birds wheeling and falling through the air and crying out in horrible voices, "King Flappy, king of all birds, 3 strangers are here." Old Wobbly looked at their cruel beaks and hard eyes and began to tremble, but Winston cried out, "King Flappy, king of all birds, we come for advice." And Flappy, who was smoking a pipe, waved his right wing and said in a rather fussy, "Oh, very well, but hurry, whatever you do, hurry." So Winston, Martin and Wobbly ran to the cave and in a few words told Flappy about the wooden box which Wobbly had found when he was digging in the garden, and asked for his advice. Flappy thought hard for a few minutes. He had to light his pipe 5 times, because each time he had an idea his pipe went out. At last he said, "I've no more tobacco for my pipe, so I cannot think any more thoughts. I must go and consult the bumblebee, for he knows everything." Then Winston, Martin and Wobbly said goodbye to Flappy and thanked him very much, and ran out of his cave as fast as they could. And as they left the cave they heard the fierce birds crying, "O King Flappy, king of all birds, strangers who came to seek your advice are gone." Now, I will continue part 2 in a minute.